For 800 years, the Tarkin Nebula had been a graveyard with no bodies, because nothing that entered ever came back out to be buried. Not Imperial dreadnoughts, not pirate raiders, not a single scavenger drone in 8 centuries of trying. So when the sensor officer aboard the Imperial cruiser Vigilant Reach screamed that something was crawling out of the nebula's edge under its own power, the entire bridge crew turned as one, certain it was a glitch. It was not a glitch. Commander Vex set down his data slate slowly, as if sudden movement might scare the anomaly back into the swirling violet clouds. On the view screen, a battered, asymmetrical hunk of metal limped out of the nebula's boundary, trailing plasma vapor from a dozen scorched hull plates. It looked less like a starship and more like something assembled by a child with spare parts and stubbornness. "Magnify," Vex said. The image sharpened. Patchwork armor. Mismatched engine nacelles. A hull that had clearly been rebuilt so many times it no longer resembled its original design. And yet it moved with purpose, gliding forward as if it had somewhere important to be. "Sir," the sensor officer said, voice tight. "Ship registry confirms human origin. Designation, the Defiance. Hull pattern matches archive records from the old colonial fleet. Vessels presumed destroyed 800 years ago, when humanity made its last stand and lost." Vex allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Humanity, the species the Empire had crushed, scattered, and largely forgotten, reduced to refugee enclaves and cautionary historical footnotes. A relic of their broken fleet had apparently been hiding in the one place no Imperial scanner could reach. "Survivors," Vex murmured, "after 8 centuries. How extraordinary." His first officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Iron, frowned at her console. "Sir, the Vigilant Reach logged 17 unidentified power fluctuations from that vessel in the last 90 seconds. The output curves don't match anything in our database. It's an antique, Iron. Of course it doesn't match our database." Vex straightened his uniform collar, already composing a report he'd send to Imperial Command. Lost human vessel recovered after 8 centuries in the Tarkin Nebula. It would make his career. "Hail them, order immediate surrender, and prepare a boarding party. Let's see what kind of museum piece we found." The hailing channel crackled open. On the bridge speakers, a woman's voice answered, calm, almost amused, utterly unafraid. "This is Captain Myra, Solis of the human vessel Defiance. We hear you, Imperial cruiser. Before you say anything else, I'd reconsider that boarding party." Vex's smile didn't waver. "Captain Solis, you are alone, outgunned, and flying a vessel that should have disintegrated decades ago. I admire the bravado. Power down your systems and prepare to be boarded. Resist, and we will be forced to disable you." There was a pause. Then, almost gently, Myra Solis said, "Commander, I want you to understand something before this happens. We didn't come out of that nebula by accident. And we didn't come out unprepared. Last chance to stand down." On the bridge of the Vigilant Reach, several officers actually laughed. Iron did not. "Sir," she said quietly, her tone doesn't match a desperate survivor. It matches someone who already knows how this ends. Vex waved a dismissive hand. "She's bluffing. 3 centuries of isolation in the empty corners of the galaxy and Vigilant Reach-class warship versus a glorified scrap heap. Helm, bring us alongside. Weapons, target their primary systems. Non-lethal disable only. I want this ship intact for the museum I'm about to build my career on." The order was given. The massive Imperial cruiser, 400 meters of gleaming armor and turbo-laser batteries, began its slow, contemptuous approach toward the small, ugly, impossible ship. Aboard the Defiance, Myra Solis sat in a captain's chair that had been rebuilt from the bones of 3 different ships, watching the Imperial cruiser swell on her view screen. Beside her, an old engineer named Tobias Wren flexed his weathered hands over a console that looked nothing like standard Imperial tech. Coils of strange dark metal woven between more familiar circuitry, humming with a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in the chest. "They're not slowing down," Tobias said. "Cocky bastards." "They've never met anyone who survived the door," Myra said. "Why would they be careful? You sure about this?" "One shot. That's all we get before they figure out we're not what they think we are." Myra's eyes didn't leave the screen. Behind them, somewhere in the churning violet dark of the Tarkin Nebula, lay the thing they had spent 800 years protecting, studying, and slowly, painfully learning to use. The thing that let a handful of human survivors turn an ancient, forbidden grave into a sanctuary, and eventually into a forge. "One shot is all we need," she said. "Tobias, charge the lance." The old engineer's hands moved across controls unlike anything the wider galaxy had seen in 8 centuries. Deep within the patchwork hull of the Defiance, something ancient and humming, and not entirely mechanical, began to wake. On the Imperial Bridge, Iron's instruments screamed a warning half a second too late. "Commander!" "Power spike. That human ship is—" A single beam of light, not quite like any weapon in Imperial records, lanced out from the Defiance. It didn't simply strike the Vigilant Reach's shields. It passed through them as though they were a polite suggestion, punched into the cruiser's primary reactor housing, and the entire ship lurched violently, alarm shrieking across every deck. Commander Vex was thrown from his chair as the lights died and emergency power flickered weakly to life. Smoke poured from 3 console stations. Outside the viewport, his 400-meter warship, the pride of his command, a vessel that had never once been seriously damaged in combat, drifted dead in space, crippled by a single shot from a ship the Empire had laughed at 30 seconds earlier. For a long, ringing silence, no one on the bridge said anything at all. Then Myra Solis's voice came through the speakers again, calm as before, though now there was something colder underneath it. "Commander Vex, you should know that was a warning shot. We could have taken out your reactor core entirely. We didn't, because we prefer this not become a war." A pause. "But if you send another ship after us, or after what's behind us in that nebula, the next shot won't be a warning." Vex pulled himself upright, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow, staring at the wreckage of his own bridge, in stunned disbelief. 800 years the Empire had called humanity weak, scattered, finished. 800 years they had been wrong. "Get me Imperial Command," he rasped. "Now. Tell them." He stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound like madness. Tell them the humans were never gone. They were waiting. Far above the crippled cruiser, the Defiance turned unhurriedly back toward the nebula's edge, its damaged hull glowing faintly with light that didn't belong to any human technology the Empire had ever cataloged, and behind it, deep in the forbidden dark, something vast and ancient stirred as if it, too, had been waiting 800 years for this exact moment to begin. Word of a crippled Imperial cruiser travels fast. Word of a crippled Imperial cruiser, destroyed by a single ship flying out of the one place in the galaxy where ships go to die. That travels faster than light itself. Or at least it felt that way to Grand Admiral Tesserin Kor when the report landed on her desk 3 hours after the engagement. She read it twice. Then she summoned every senior officer within a day's travel of her flagship, the Empire's will, and told them all the same thing. "Cancel your plans. We're going to the Tarkin Nebula." "With respect, Grand Admiral," said one of her captains, a broad-shouldered man named Drenish Kerr, "sending a fleet after one damaged human relic seems." "It is not one ship anymore, Captain." Kor's voice cut through the briefing room like a blade. "Commander Vex report states the vessel fired a weapon that bypassed Imperial shielding entirely." "Bypassed it, Captain. Not overwhelmed it. Not brute-forced it. Bypassed it. As though our shields were a polite suggestion they chose not to take. That is not a relic. That is something we don't understand, wielded by people we assume were extinct." The room went quiet. Kor let it sit there a moment before continuing. 800 years ago, the Empire fought humanity to what we believed was annihilation. We told ourselves they were primitive, disorganized, doomed by their own infighting. We told ourselves a great many comfortable things. She tapped a control, and the view screen behind her lit up with sensor data from the crippled Vigilant Reach. And for 800 years, not one single Imperial vessel that entered the Tarkin Nebula ever sent back a transmission. We called it a natural hazard, a gravitational anomaly. We never once asked a question that should have been obvious. "What question, Grand Admiral?" asked Ishkur. "What if something was guarding it?" Within 12 hours, a fleet of 47 Imperial warships, led by the Empire's will, entered formation at the edge of the Tarkin Nebula. It was the largest assembled Imperial force in over a century, not because Core expected a battle that scale, but because she had learned, in 30 years of service, that the gravest mistakes always began with underestimation. Aboard the Defiance, Myra Solis watched the fleet's arrival on a screen patched together from 3 different generations of salvage tech, her jaw tight. "That's not a capture force," Tobias said beside her, watching the same readouts. "That's an extermination fleet. They're scared," Myra said. "Good. Scared people listen. Eventually. They just need to survive long enough to start." Behind her, in the cramped corridor that led to the ship's modest crew quarters, 11 other survivors of the long human exile gathered, watching the same numbers climb on a secondary display. 47 warships, each one larger and more heavily armed than the entire surviving population of free humanity could have built in 100 years. "Myra," said a younger voice, Eli, barely 20, who had grown up entirely within the bounds of the nebula and had never known any other home. "Are we ready for this?" Myra turned to face her crew, the small, stubborn, impossible family that had spent 800 years passing down stories, technology, and hope through generation after generation, waiting for a day they'd half believed might never come. "We've been ready for 800 years, she said. "We're not going to lose our nerve in the last 8 minutes." She turned back to the comm panel and opened a channel, not to the fleet's flagship, but broadcast-wide, on every frequency Imperial ships use for fleet-wide communication. She wanted every single crew member on every single ship to hear this. "This is Captain Myra Solis of the human vessel Defiance, addressing the Imperial fleet currently amassed at the edge of the Tarkin Nebula." Her voice was steady, carrying clearly across the open channel. "I know what you've been told to do here. I know what your commanders believe about what's waiting in this nebula and about what we are. I'm going to tell you the truth, because you deserve better than fear-based orders." On the bridge of the Empire's will, Grand Admiral Core leaned forward, listening intently despite herself. 800 years ago, your empire drove humanity to the edge of extinction," Myra continued. "We fled into the one place your sensors couldn't follow, a place you call cursed, forbidden, deadly. You were right that it was deadly. You were wrong about why. The Tarkin Nebula isn't a graveyard. It's a door. And on the other side of that door, we found something that didn't destroy us. It transformed us." Core's first officer glanced at her, uncertain. "Grand Admiral, should we cut this transmission?" "No," Core said quietly. "Let it play. I want to hear what 800 years of hiding sounds like. We are not here for revenge," Myra's voice went on, steady and unwavering. "We're not here to conquer or to punish or to repeat the cycle your empire has repeated for 1,000 years. Conquest control. The belief that strength is measured by how many worlds you can crush beneath your boots. We're here because the thing we found in this nebula has shown us a different kind of strength, and we intend to prove it, whether your empire chooses to listen or chooses to fight." She paused, letting the silence stretch across 47 ships' worth of listening crews. "One ship disabled one of your cruisers without taking a single life aboard it. That was restraint, not weakness. If this fleet advances into the nebula with hostile intent, you will discover exactly how much further that restraint extends, and exactly how little further it will. The choice is yours. It has always, eventually been yours." The channel went silent. On the Empire's Will's Bridge, no one spoke for several long seconds. Then Captain Ashkur broke the silence. "Grand Admiral, orders?" Core stared at the swirling violet boundary of the nebula on the view screen, at the small, broken-looking shape of the Defiance hovering at its edge like a sentinel that had been standing guard far longer than any of them had been alive. "Hold formation," she said finally. "No one fires unless fired upon. I want full sensor sweeps of that vessel, and full historical pulls on every scrap of pre-war human technology in the archives. If they're telling the truth about what's in that nebula, I want to know what we're actually looking at before I send a single ship deeper into that dark." She did not yet know that the decision she'd just made, to wait, to watch, to question instead of immediately destroy, was the first decision in 800 years of Imperial history that the ancient intelligence sleeping beyond the door had been waiting to see an Imperial commander make. 3 hours of silence stretched between the Imperial fleet and the small human ship floating at the nebula's edge, and silence, Grand Admiral Corps knew, never lasted in war. It was only ever the space between one decision and the next. That decision came from the most predictable place possible. Commander Vex, still humiliated, still nursing a cut above his eyebrow and a far deeper wound to his pride, requested, and was granted, permission to lead a strike team aboard a salvage frigate to retrieve debris samples from the area near the Defiance. Corps suspected, even as she approved it, that Vex's true intention had little to do with debris. She was right. Vex's frigate, the Iron Pursuit, broke formation 40 minutes later and angled directly toward the Defiance, weapons charged, ostensibly for defensive readiness. Aboard the human ship, sensors lit up immediately. They're not retrieving debris, Tobias said grimly, watching the frigate's approach vector. That's an attack run. Myra's expression hardened. Vex again. Of course it is. Man can't let go of a bruised ego. She turned to the ship's intercom. All hands, this is the captain. Stand by to deploy the swarm. Eli, you're up. In the modest cargo hold that had once carried grain and medical supplies for refugee enclaves, young Eli Voss settled into a control rig built from components no Imperial engineer would recognize. Threads of dark, faintly luminous metal woven through more conventional circuitry, the same strange technology that powered the Defiance's main weapon. Drone bay opening, Eli reported, voice tight with concentration, but steady. Releasing the swarm. From hidden compartments along the Defiance's battered hull, panels slid open one after another, and hundreds of small, sleek drones poured out into open space like a flock of silver birds startled into flight. They moved with an eerie, coordinated precision. Not the rigid formation flying of Imperial automated systems, but something closer to a living school of fish, shifting and rippling as a single fluid organism. Aboard the Iron Pursuit, Vex watched the swarm deploy with a flicker of genuine alarm beneath his contempt. Sensors. What in the stars am I looking at? Unknown drone technology. Commander. 312 individual units and climbing. There, the sensor officer's voice cracked. Sir, they're adapting their formation to our shield frequency in real time. I've never seen anything recalibrate that fast. Target the largest cluster and fire. Vex snapped. The Iron Pursuit's turbo lasers opened up, lancing bright bolts of energy into the swarm. A dozen drones were vaporized instantly, but the rest scattered and reformed before the second volley even landed, flowing around the frigate's fire like water around stones. Within seconds, they'd spread into a perfect dispersed sphere around the Iron Pursuit, too numerous and too erratic to target effectively, too small individually to be worth dedicated weapons fire. Sir, they're not attacking, the sensor officer said, baffled. They're just surrounding us. That was true, and it was deliberate. Aboard the Defiance, Eli's hands moved across the control rig with practiced calm. Swarms in position, captain. Full envelopment of the frigate. No offensive action yet. Good. Myra said, hold there. Let's see if Vex has learned anything in the last 6 hours. She opened a channel to the Iron Pursuit. Commander Vex, I believe I made myself clear to your Grand Admiral. That swarm could disable every system on your ship in under 10 seconds if I gave the order. I haven't given it. I'd encourage you to consider why. On the Iron Pursuit's bridge, Vex's hands were clenched so tightly on his armrest that his knuckles had gone white. Around his ship, 300-plus drones hovered in silent, perfect formation, an absolute and total demonstration of power that asked for nothing and threatened everything. It was Grand Admiral Corps' voice that broke the standoff, cutting it on an open fleet channel, with an edge sharp enough to draw blood. Iron Pursuit, this is Empire's will. Stand down immediately and return to formation. That is a direct order, Commander Vex. And if I have to repeat it, your next command will be a supply depot on the most remote rock I can find. There was a long pause. Then, grudgingly, Vex's voice came back, tight with barely contained fury. Acknowledge. Returning to formation. The swarm, as if reading the de-escalation in real time, smoothly withdrew from around the Iron Pursuit and flowed back toward the Defiance in the same eerie, fluid unison with which it had deployed. Aboard the Empire's will, Kor stood at her viewport for a long moment after the channel closed, watching the drone swarm dissolve back into the small battered ship that had, in the space of a single day, Myra questioned 800 years of imperial certainty about what humanity was and what it had become. Grand Admiral, her first officer said quietly, that wasn't a weapon demonstration. It was a leash. They could have destroyed that frigate outright and chose not to. Twice now. I know, Kor said. That's what worries me more than if they'd simply opened fire. She turned from the viewport. Get me everything we have on pre-war human strategic doctrine, and get me a secure channel to Captain Solis. Not a fleet-wide broadcast. A direct private line. You're going to talk to her? I'm going to listen to her, Kor corrected. There's a difference, Lieutenant, and it's one I suspect very few Imperial officers in our history have ever bothered to learn. Minutes later, the private channel opened between the two ships. A flagship 400 times the mass of the vessel was calling, and the small, scarred survivor of 8 centuries in the dark. Captain Solis, Kor said, her voice carefully neutral. Grand Admiral Tesserin Kor, I'd like to understand what's actually happening here, before either of our sides does something neither of us can undo. There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Kor wondered if the channel had failed. Then Myra Solis's voice came through, quieter than it had been on a fleet-wide broadcast, almost relieved. Grand Admiral, that's the first sentence anyone in your empire has said to us in 800 years that sounded like a question instead of a verdict. Another pause. I think it's time you saw what's actually waiting behind us. Are you willing to come and look, instead of just pointing guns at it? Kor glanced at her first officer, who looked back at her with an expression that was somewhere between alarm and grudging curiosity. Tell me where, Kor said, and tell me what I'm walking into. The truth, Myra said simply, for the first time in 800 years. That's exactly what you're walking into. Grand Admiral Kor made a decision that would define the rest of her career, and arguably the rest of galactic history. In the space of about 4 seconds, standing alone in her quarters aboard the Empire's will, staring at a star chart of the Tarkin Nebula that had told Imperial cartographers nothing useful for 800 years. She would go, alone, aboard a small shuttle, with no weapons charged and no fleet escort. It was the single most reckless decision of her 30-year career, and she made it anyway, because some part of her, the part that had joined Imperial Navy as an idealistic cadet decades before cynicism and ambition had worn that idealism down to something harder and more practical, recognized that an empire which only ever responded to mystery with firepower would never actually learn anything. Grand Admiral, this is... Her first officer began when she informed of the plan. Madness, I know, Kor said. Hold the fleet at the boundary. No one follows me in. If I'm not back in 6 hours, assume the worst and act accordingly. But give me those 6 hours, Lieutenant. I mean to use every minute of them. Her shuttle, small and unarmed, fell into formation behind the Defiance as the battered human ship turned back toward the swirling violet wall of the nebula. Kor watched through her viewport as the boundary that had swallowed every Imperial vessel for 8 centuries without exception drew closer, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something disturbingly close to fear. Captain Solis, she said over the comm, I feel obligated to mention that no ship has ever returned from where we're heading. No Imperial ship, Myra corrected gently. Ships have returned plenty of times, Grand Admiral. You just never heard about it, because the only people who knew how to come back out were people your empire had already written off as extinct. A pause. Stay close. The nebula reads unfamiliar engine signatures as threats if they're alone. With us, you'll be fine. The transition to the nebula's boundary was unlike anything in Kor's experience. Not the violent gravitational shredding her instruments had always predicted, but a strange, almost gentle pressure, as if the nebula itself were testing the intentions of everything that crossed its threshold. Outside her viewport, the swirling violet clouds parted in patterns too deliberate to be natural, revealing not chaos, but structure. The skeletal remains of ancient orbital platforms, long dormant shipyards built into asteroid hollows, the faint ember glow of habitats that had clearly sustained life for a very long time. This is... Kor struggled for words. This is a civilization. It's home, Myra said simply. or it has been for 8 generations of us. At the heart of the cleared region, where the nebula's violet haze thinned to near transparency, an enormous structure hung suspended in space. Not a ship, not a station, but something that defied easy categorization. It was vast, ring-shaped, etched with patterns of dark, faintly glowing metal that pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves, like something breathing. "We call it the door," Myra said, as the Defiance and Core's small shuttle drew closer. "Our ancestors found it 800 years ago, fleeing your empire with nothing left to lose. It wasn't built by humans, and it wasn't built by anyone the historical records of any species we've encountered have ever heard of. It's ancient, older than the Empire, possibly older than civilized life in this entire arm of the galaxy." Core stared at the structure, every Imperial instinct in her screaming that something this powerful, this unknown, should be reported, studied, contained, weaponized. And beneath that instinct, something quieter and more honest recognized that she was looking at proof of exactly how small the Empire's 800-year reign over the galaxy actually was, against the true scope of what existed beyond its borders. "What does it do?" she asked. "It changes things," Myra said. "Ships, people. It looks into what you already are, and it helps you become more fully that, for better or worse. Our ancestors who came through it desperate, angry, and bent on revenge against your empire, the door showed them something different. It showed them that revenge would only repeat the same cycle of conquest your empire has run for 1,000 years. It gave us power, Grand Admiral, but it also gave us a choice about what to do with it. We chose to wait, to watch, to become something worth showing the galaxy, instead of something that simply wanted to win. And now we think it's time the rest of the galaxy got the same choice." As if summoned by the conversation itself, the great ring of the door pulsed with sudden, brighter light, and the Defiance, scarred patchwork, 800 years of stubborn survival built into every battered hull plate, began to glide toward its center. "Captain Solis," Core said, alarm sharpening her voice, "what's happening?" "It's time you saw what the door can really do," Myra said. "Hold your position. Grand Admiral, this is an attack. It's an introduction." The Defiance slid into the ring's exact center, and for a long moment, nothing happened at all. Core's shuttle hanging silent in the dark beside the ancient structure, her crew aboard the Empires was 6 hours and an entire universe of doubt away. Then light, vast and silent and utterly unlike anything in any Imperial weapons database, flooded outward from the door, wrapping around the small human ship at heart, and Grand Admiral Core watched breathless as 800 years of patient waiting finally found its moment to become something new. The light from the door did not burn. It did not destroy. It simply changed, and Grand Admiral Core, watching from the relative safety of her small shuttle, found herself unable to look away even as every rational instinct told her she was witnessing something no Imperial mind was equipped to fully understand. The Defiance's battered hull, patched together over 800 years from the wreckage of a dozen different ships, began to shift. The mismatched armor plates didn't simply repair themselves. They flowed, reorganizing into smooth, seamless curves unlike any human or Imperial engineering corps had ever studied. The dull, scorched metal brightened into something with faint, living luster, threaded through with veins of the same dark, glowing material that powered the ship's strange weapons and drone swarm. "Captain Solis," Core said, voice unsteady despite herself. "Talk to me. Is your crew safe?" There was a long pause before Myra's voice returned, and when it did, it carried an emotion Core couldn't quite place. Wonder, maybe, or relief, 800 years in the making. "We're safe, Grand Admiral," Myra said. "More than safe. This is what the door has been preparing us for. It only does this once a generation, when it judges a moment is finally right. We weren't entirely sure today would be that moment until it happened. Aboard the Defiance, the bridge had transformed into something that no longer resembled patchwork salvage at all. The walls pulsed with soft, organic light. The controls to Bias had spent decades rebuilding from scavenged Imperial and pre-war human tech now seemed to respond to thought as much as touch, the ship systems folding seamlessly into something that felt less like a machine and more like a living extension of its crew's will. "Status," Myra said, gripping the arms of her chair as the transformation settled. "Captain, I don't." Tobias's voice was hushed with awe. Captain, the ship's integrated. Power output is 14 times what was an hour ago. Shield capacity, propulsion, everything. It's not just repaired, it's evolved. Outside, the Imperial fleet at the nebula's boundary and the small Imperial shuttle hovering nearby watched as the Defiance emerged from the door's light, no longer a battered relic of a dying refugee fleet, but something sleek, luminous, and unmistakably alive in a way that defied easy categorization. It was still recognizably the same ship, the same proud, stubborn lines of its original design intact beneath the transformation, but elevated, completed, finally whole after 8 centuries of patchwork survival. Kor's comm crackled with an incoming transmission from her own fleet. Grand Admiral, this is Empire's will. Our sensors are reading massive power fluctuations from your position. Are you secure? I'm secure, Lieutenant, Kor said, eyes still fixed on the transformed ship before her. Hold the fleet's position. I need everyone to see what I'm seeing right now, and I need them to see it without their weapons charged. She opened the channel to the Defiance again. Captain Solis, I have to ask the question my entire empire is going to ask the moment I report this. That ship, what you've just become, is it a weapon? Myra's answer came without hesitation. It can be if it has to be, but that's not what it's for. The door doesn't give power to people who want to conquer, Grand Admiral. It gives power to people who've already decided what they're willing to do with it before they ever ask for it. 800 years ago, our ancestors came through this nebula desperate and angry, ready to burn the galaxy down out of grief for everything your empire had taken from them. The door changed that anger into something else. Patience, purpose, the conviction that the only way to actually end a war that's lasted this long is to refuse to keep fighting it the same way it's always been fought. Kor was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the words but the sheer weight of what they implied. 8 centuries of careful, deliberate restraint, waiting for exactly this moment, this conversation, this choice. And if I go back to my empire and tell them what I just saw, Kor said slowly, what happens next is entirely up to them. It always has been, Myra said. We could have come out of this nebula 100 years ago and burned half your fleet to ash for what was done to us. We had the power to do it long before today. We chose not to every single time because we understood something that took our ancestors generations of pain to learn, that strength used only to dominate eventually destroys the hand that wields it. We didn't come back to win a war, Grand Admiral. We came back to end one. The transformed Defiance drifted closer to Kor's small shuttle, its luminous hull casting soft light across the cabin, and for the first time since this entire impossible day had begun, Grand Admiral Tesserin Kor felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not the calculating ambition that had driven 30 years of Imperial service, but something closer to hope, fragile and unfamiliar after a lifetime spent inside a system built entirely on conquest. Show me how this ends, Captain Solis, she said quietly. Show me what peace is actually supposed to look like. Because I'll be honest with you, in 30 years of Imperial service, no one has ever once shown me. Then come back to the fleet with me, Myra said, and let's find out together. The transformed Defiance and Grand Admiral Kor's small shuttle emerged from the Tarkin Nebula together, and for the second time in less than a day, every sensor station across 47 Imperial warships fell silent in collective disbelief. The ship that had limped out of the nebula hours earlier as a battered, patchwork relic now glided forward sleek, luminous, and unmistakably transformed, and beside it, in plain, undeniable view of the entire fleet, flew the shuttle their own Grand Admiral, returning not as a prisoner, not in distress, but escorted, unharmed, and very clearly in the middle of a conversation she had no intention of cutting short. All ships. Kor broadcast on the open fleet channel the moment her shuttle cleared the nebula's boundary. Stand down from combat readiness. I repeat, stand down from combat readiness. This is a direct order, and I will personally review the record of any commander who disobeys it. On the bridge of the Iron Pursuit, Commander Vex stared at the transformed human vessel with an expression caught somewhere between fury and disbelief. His hand hovering near a weapons console, he no longer had any legal authority to use. Aboard the Defiance, Myra Solis watched the assembled fleet with the same steady calm she carried through the entire impossible day. Grand Admiral, she said over the comm. Your fleet's about to learn something that's taken my people 800 years to fully understand. I'd suggest you tell them before fear does the explaining for you. Kor didn't hesitate. She opened the fleet-wide channel, her voice carrying clearly to every bridge, every crew member, every officer who spent the last day bracing for a war 8 centuries in the making. This is Grand Admiral Tesserin Kor addressing the entire fleet, and, through this channel, the Imperial Senate and Imperial Command on the homeworld. She paused, gathering the words she knew would define the rest of her career, and possibly the rest of galactic history. 800 years ago, our empire fought a war against humanity that we believed ended in their extinction. We were wrong. They survived not by hiding in weakness, but by finding something far older and more powerful than our entire Imperial fleet combined, and choosing, again and again, for 8 centuries, not to use it for conquest. She glanced toward the viewport, where the Defiance hung in serene, luminous silence beside her shuttle. I have seen what they found. I have seen what they become. And I am telling every officer in this fleet and every official back on the homeworld who will eventually hear this transmission that the Empire stands at a choice point unlike any in our history. We can continue a war that has already cost both sides 800 years and uncountable lives, against a people who have just demonstrated they possess power we cannot match and the restraint not to use it against us first. Or we can recognize, finally, that the only way this war ends in anything other than mutual destruction is if someone has the courage to stop fighting it. The silence that followed stretched across 47 ships, thousands of crew members, and Kor knew would soon stretch across an entire empire built on 1,000 years of conquest, struggling to absorb a simple idea it had never seriously entertained. That peace might be the stronger choice. It was Commander Vex, predictably, who broke the silence, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. Grand Admiral, with respect, you're asking us to simply surrender to a power we don't understand, based on a word of? I am not asking anyone to surrender, Commander, Kor cut in, her voice hard. I am asking this fleet and this empire to consider the possibility that strength and conquest are not the same thing, and that an empire which has never once seriously entertained that distinction has, perhaps, been fighting the wrong war for a very long time. She let that sit for a moment. Captain Solis has made it clear that humanity did not return to destroy us. They returned because the alternative, watching the same cycle of fear and domination repeat indefinitely, was no longer something they were willing to accept as inevitable. I find I agree with them. Aboard the Defiance, Myra listened to broadcasts with quiet satisfaction. Her crew gathered close around her, watching the same transmission ripple outward across the fleet. She's actually doing it, Eli said softly, disbelief and hope warring in his young voice. 800 years, and she's actually doing it. One person can't end a war alone, Myra said. But one person choosing to stop fighting, it is always where it actually starts. She turned to the comm panel and opened a final channel, addressing the fleet directly. Commander Vex, every officer listening who's still bracing for a fight. I understand the fear. I understand the distrust. Your empire spent 800 years building a story about humanity that made us safe to dismiss, and dismissing us was easier than reckoning with what was actually done to us. But I'm not interested in punishing anyone for that story today. I'm interested in what comes after it. She paused, looking out at the assembled fleet. The small shuttle carrying an Imperial Grand Admiral who had chosen curiosity over conquest, and beyond them all, the violet boundary of the nebula that had kept her people safe and patient for 8 long centuries. My ancestors came through that door with nothing left but grief and the desire for revenge. It would have been easy to become exactly the kind of power your empire feared most. Instead, we became something else. And today, for the first time, your empire has a chance to become something else too. Not through defeat, through choice. In the weeks that followed, the story of that single day, the crippled cruiser, the ancient door, the fleet that stood down, and the Grand Admiral who chose to listen instead of fire, spread across the empire faster than any official report could contain it. Some officers, like Vex, never forgave the perceived humiliation, and spent years afterward as bitter, isolated voices arguing for a war that fewer and fewer people had the appetite to fight. Others, inspired by Kor's example, began the long, difficult work of dismantling 1,000 years of imperial doctrine built entirely on the assumption that strength meant control. It was not a fast peace, or an easy one. Old hatreds did not dissolve overnight, and the Empire's transition from 1,000 years of conquest towards something resembling genuine partnership with the people it had once tried to destroy took years of painstaking negotiation, setbacks, and the slow, stubborn work of trust rebuilt one decision at a time. But it began that day in the quiet after a single warning shot that could have started a war and instead, against every historical precedent, started something else entirely. Captain Myra Solis and the crew of the Defiance, reborn, transformed, finally whole after 800 years of patient waiting, became something between legend and diplomat in the years that followed. Proof, walking and flying and undeniable, that the measure of true strength had never been the size of a fleet or the power of its weapons, but the courage to lay down a war that had already cost far too much, and the patience to build something better in its place. And deep within the Tarkin Nebula, the ancient door continued its slow, silent pulse, waiting, as it always had, for the next moment when someone, somewhere, would prove ready to become more fully what they had always had the courage to be,